Hello, everyone, and welcome to this month's Parents Know webinar series. I'm Karen Russell, a part of the Brain Balance team, and as always, it's great to be back with you. Last month, we talked about how to prepare for a successful school year. We provided some really great practical advice on what you can do as a parent to set your child up for success. So if you weren't able to join us, I'd recommend going back and giving that a watch. You can find it on our website. But today, we're going deeper. We're going to get into all of the things that need to happen in your child's brain so they can succeed. And I will tell you, there's nobody better to help us understand this complex topic than our guest today, Dr. Mark Goldenberg. A few things before we get started. We are recording this discussion, so you can refer to it later or share it with others that might find it interesting. And also, you can type your questions in the dashboard at any time, and we'll answer them during the Q&A at the end. So now I will hand it over to my colleague and guide through today's conversation, Brain Balance Chief Programs Officer, Dr. Rebecca Jackson. Hi, Rebecca, take it away.
Thanks, Karen. As Karen mentioned, we are really excited for today's conversation. We've been looking forward to it for several weeks anyway, and then I have to say I had an experience last night that just hit home even more for this conversation. I'm the parent of an 8th grader and a 10th grader, and last night was the open house for the high school. And so as a part of that open house, you went around to meet each of the high school teachers and hear about the class. And one of my daughter's teachers made the point to all of the parents of what a big year sophomore year in high school is for the students. And she was saying it's an important year, but it's also a challenging year. It's a year where the kids add a lot of new and additional load and challenges to their plate. So sophomore year in high school, a lot of the kids get driver's license. So in addition to their school and sports and activities, they're also juggling driving. A lot of students begin to get jobs at this age. There's the introduction of relationships. So the teacher was making the point to the class of how important time management is for our sophomores and how a lot of them need help. And I have to tell you, as she said that, all I could hear was executive function, how important executive function is for our sophomore year in high school. And as she said that, multiple parents throughout the classroom groaned, knowing that that could potentially be a challenge for their child. So whether your child is a sophomore in high school or in kindergarten, there are executive function needs and demands at every level. So today we're really going to dig deep into how our executive functions support our kids throughout their day, all day, every day, and support their success in the classroom. Who we have joining us here today is Dr. Mark Goldenberg. So I'm going to read you his bio and introduction quickly. Dr. Mark Goldenberg is a board-certified chiropractic neurologist and a board-certified cognitive specialist who specializes in the treatment of learning disabilities, dyslexia, attention deficit disorders, and spectrum disorders. Dr. Goldenberg is a fellow of the American College of Functional Neurology with a subspecialty in neurobehavioral disorders of childhood. His peer-reviewed paper entitled Hemispheric Integration, Therapy, and Treatment of ADHD has been published in the Journal of Functional Neurology, Rehabilitation, and Ergonomics. Dr. Goldenberg has been practicing in his field since 1985 after graduating from New York Chiropractic College. He devotes all of his time to working with children and adults with attention and learning challenges and is the owner since 2009 of the Brain Balance Center of Norwalk, Connecticut. In addition to that, Dr. Goldenberg is somebody that I see as a personal friend and mentor. I have the honor and privilege of working with Dr. Goldenberg these days on a near daily basis, as he also serves on our Brain Balance Program Council. So he is an individual who is unique in that his heart is as big as his brain, and his brain is enormous. He knows more about neurology and development than just about anybody I know. So Dr. Mark, thank you for joining us today for this conversation.
Oh, it's my pleasure, and thank you for that long introduction.
I mean, you're an impressive guy, and we're thrilled to have you here. So as we kick off things for today, we think about from the moment we wake up in the morning, we're making decisions every step of the day about what I'm going to do with my time. My alarm goes off. Am I getting up? Am I hitting snooze? It starts from moment one in the day. But before we start really talking about everything, will you start by giving us a framework? If you'll give us the definition for executive functions, and then help us understand, that's sort of an umbrella term. There's a lot of separate pieces that fall under the category of executive function. So if you'll start by teeing that up for us.
Yes. So there are a lot of different definitions per se of executive function. The one I felt was most appropriate in reading the book, The Executive Brain by Elkahan Goldberg, who's a professor of neurology at NYU. He defines executive functions as the coordination of many cognitive skills into a cohesive, goal-oriented response. So if we break that down, let's think about that. Everyone, whether it's a child, an adult, has a goal for something. But in order to achieve that goal, you have to coordinate many, many different cognitive systems to achieve that goal. So some of them are attention, organization, time management, making a right decision, emotional control, reasoning, planning that goal based on past experiences. So your goal is headed in the right direction. So these are what we call executive skills, because an executive of a company would need to use these skills to run a company efficiently.
Victoria, would you mind pulling up the graphic for us that breaks down those executive functions? And one of the things I want to point out, that's interesting to me that I've seen over the years, and Mark, you can speak to this a little bit more, is as a parent, and everybody that's attending the webinar, you've got access to this. If you click the link, you can download this resource. This is a resource that I would print and hang on to. And when you look at these individual aspects of executive function, circle the ones that you notice your kids struggling with. And one of the things that I want you to note is oftentimes when there's a challenge in one area, it's going to impact more than one area. So maybe you know that your child struggles with impulse control, where they tend to act before thinking. And so maybe their goal is to complete their homework and get it turned in the next day, but right now they're chasing the dog around the house because the dog came up, caught their attention, and they acted on impulse. So circle the area that you notice your child struggling with. And again, you may notice that there's more than one area. But Mark, as we look at these individual areas, do you mind giving us some specific real life examples of, for example, flexible thinking? If a child or student struggles with flexible thinking, that aspect of executive functioning, what could that look like in real life?
Sure. So a lot of children are what we call mentally inflexible. Okay, so what is flexible thinking? Flexible thinking is when a child has a specific or is fixated on a specific thing. Let's say they're playing with their Legos. Let's say they're playing on electronics. Let's say they're doing something that they're motivated to do, but then mom or dad will come into the room and say, okay, Sarah, it's time to stop playing your Lego and it's time to do your homework. So mental flexibility requires Sarah to say, okay, I'm flexible. I could stop playing my Lego now and it's time to do my homework. But when your child is mentally inflexible, that could cause a full-blown tantrum. That could be like throwing a wrench into a gear shaft, because the child's brain is working in a certain, in their reality. And if certain parts of the brain are not mature enough or working correctly, that thought can't be turned off. So that could cause a blow up or a tantrum. So mental flexibility, flexible thinking is being able to switch easily from one thought to another thought, from one procedure to another in a flexible, smooth, coordinated manner.
And I think as parents, it's so easy to look at that and say, well, they just don't want to stop playing the game. It's they love the game, or it's just a negative behavior. But I think it's important to note that oftentimes those behaviors are coming from a very specific brain function or ability.
That's correct. And, a lot of times I use the terms, the child, for the most part, has no control over this. And really, there are many, many things to do to give that child back control of their own brain.
And I think that's important to understand, where we tend to, as parents, hold our kids accountable for their actions, which is, something that we're supposed to do as parents so that we can help guide and teach and correct. But it's understanding where they're at in terms of development to know what's an appropriate expectation for what they are able to control and what is outside their control. Dr. Goldenberg, as we look at some of these additional executive function pieces, let's talk about how working memory contributes to your executive functions throughout the day.
Sure. So working memory is very fascinating. And when we talk a little later, we're going to talk about the part of the brain that controls these things. But working memory really is bringing online information necessary to carry out specific tasks. So for example, a child wakes up in the morning and they know they have to take care of their hygiene, they have to get dressed, they have to eat breakfast, prepare their backpack. What homework do they have to bring to school? Okay, so this information has to be brought online in real time. So working memory is the ability to bring all these types of memory pieces into real time so you could now start working on them. And it's controlled by a part of the brain called the frontal lobe. And we'll get into that a little later, but the part of the brain that controls executive skills doesn't have this information. It has to pull it from different parts of the brain. So working memory is really online memory. And parents will say to me, every day I have to tell her, get up, get dressed, brush your teeth, change, come in the kitchen, eat your breakfast. Okay, well, that sounds very easy, but if those parts of the brain are not working correctly or are weak, it's just not going to happen. So that's really what working memory is.
Well, and it also brings to mind the example that I hear often, and I know you've heard this as well, is the parent that says they've done the homework, but they haven't turned it in. And that's mind-boggling, right? You did the hard work to complete a difficult math assignment, but then you didn't do the final step of turning it in. And again, so often as parents, we can view that as the child doesn't care. Are they being lazy? Are they, do they just not care? Are they not trying? But that can go back to that goal-oriented behavior and working memory of, do they have that information active in their mind to know that they completed the assignment and it still needs to be turned in? So maybe they were thinking about that homework assignment the night before. Are they able to maintain that information at 10 a.m. the next day when they're sitting in math class? And if a teacher doesn't prompt them to turn it in, to complete that goal-oriented task.
So that's exactly correct. And I'll just add another thing, which is very important. When a child is trying their best to do something, but doesn't have the mental capacity to, for example, remember to bring their homework in, what do they hear? I told you a million times, you got to bring your homework. Where's your homework? Gets to school. The teacher says, where's your homework, Johnny? The child is trying their best to do this. And when they hear these types of comments, they're going to start developing low self-esteem. So we don't want our children to develop low self-esteem for something they cannot control.
And I think about the executive function skills like a skill like riding a bike. And what I mean by that is the executive function skills are things that we're not born with. They're not there from day one. They happen on top of our development, and we can go into that more here coming up next. But so if we see a child that's struggling in one or more of these areas, I think as parents, our reaction is to want to have them practice that thing. And so if you're forgetting to turn in your homework, what strategy can we put in place to make sure you do it? But it's like trying to teach a child to ride a bike if they don't have the balance and coordination and timing. That's going to be really, really difficult to teach something if the child isn't developmentally there. Same thing with tying your shoes. If you're having a hard time teaching a child to tie their shoes, chances are you need to back up and mature the fine motor skills. I find it's the same with our executive function skills. So a child that's needing additional scaffolding and support, additional reminders, additional prompts to complete a task on time, to manage their time, to turn homework in. That to me, it can be a signal that, hey, there's something more going on underneath in development, that they're needing extra help and support in these areas.
That's exactly correct. So what you're describing, Rebecca, is very common in school systems and in life. It's known as a top-down approach. So the top-down approach is, okay, let me give you an organizer. Let me tell you the night before, this is what you have to do. Let me teach you how to remember these skills. But if the brain is not functionally capable of doing this, those top-down approaches most times do not work. So we need to take a different approach, which is really known as a bottom-up approach.
So let's use that as a segue to talk about that. So we know that, I could be a parent of multiple kids, right? I'm a parent of 2 kids. I have one child that is able to complete homework, turn things in. If plans change, they move through things very flexibly. And as a parent, maybe there's another child in the household that needs more help and support with these things. What is it about development that contributes to the ability to develop these skills? And what does it look like when development goes awry, complicating these things?
So the neuroscientific research is very clear in terms of where these executive functions are housed in the brain. And they're housed in the brain in an area known as the frontal lobe or prefrontal cortex. So if we could show maybe perfect. So obviously we see all these different parts of the brain, they're all color coded. The frontal lobe is called the frontal lobe because it's in the front. So the blue area is the front of the brain. The dark blue area is the back of the brain. And the prefrontal cortex is even a little more in the front of the brain than next to the green area. So what's very important to understand is that the frontal lobe develops from birth, starting with simple movements, starting with simple reflexes, lifting of the head, crawling, reaching, tracking with the eyes. Basic motor and sensory functions really set the stage for goal-oriented, purposeful movements. Even a baby, when they start to crawl and they see an object, at a certain age, their frontal part of the brain knows, let me go to that object. So that's a goal-oriented response. And these things have to happen, but they're only happening when all these other systems start to work correctly. So we could start seeing problems with crawling, lifting the head. Certain milestones aren't met. Speech issues, delayed speech. So when we start seeing missed milestones and these areas of the brain that typically have to build one on top of another in a normal trajectory of the brain, when these aspects are not occurring correctly, then the brain takes a different trajectory. The good news is that trajectory could be brought back on track through various types of activities.
And that's, one of the things that I've heard often over the years as well is there's times when we're meeting or visiting with a family and a family knows that from early on there were missed milestones, there were delays. Maybe a child crawled late, walked late, struggled with some of those early missed milestones. But that's not always the case. We also work with and have met with a lot of families over the years where those early milestones from what the parents were seeing and tracking were on track. They spoke on time, they crawled early, they walked early. Give us some examples of, if a child starts developmentally on track, what are some things that a parent could watch for, say in a 10-year-old, that might clue them in that there's some executive function challenges there that may be coming from later development and not as much from very early on development?
Right. So again, the frontal lobe is the most connected part of the brain, but the frontal lobe doesn't store this type of information. It gets and receives information. If you look at this graphic, we see cerebellum on the bottom. Well, the cerebellum is critical for timing of motor movement, timing of thought. So if we have children who maybe have coordination issues or balance issues, what we call proprioception or body awareness issues, or sensory issues, we see this green area, sensory motor cortex. So a lot of children are hypersensitive to certain textures, Or on the other hand, they might not even feel certain aspects of their body, or go out in the cold in shorts and a t-shirt when it's 10 degrees out. So these types of issues let us understand that all these different parts of the brain, aside from the blue you see in the frontal lobe needs all this information from all these other parts of the brain and the body to make appropriate decisions. So if these other areas are not maturing correctly, red flags could be lack of coordination, sensory sensitivity, auditory processing issues. So all of these different areas of the brain, and there's another part of the brain that receives information from the whole body, the feeling of touch, body awareness. All these different areas go into a part of the brain known as the thalamus, which is like Grand Central Station. But then that part of the brain sends that information to the prefrontal cortex. Now, if any of these areas are not maturing correctly, the frontal lobe is not getting the appropriate information. And if the frontal lobe does not get appropriate information, it cannot make appropriate executive decisions.
So I think a fair summary of that, and agree or disagree with this, but I feel like a fair summary of that is if you're seeing executive function challenges in any of those areas from that first graphic, working memory, emotional regulation, time management, organization, any of those areas, that's a red flag that something in lower development has gone awry, complicating that executive ability to make decisions.
You're 100% correct, because again, the frontal lobe needs, like any executive in a company needs appropriate information on a daily basis from the lower echelons of the company. If those other areas, subsets of the company, are not giving the executive appropriate information, well, the executive is not going to be able to make the appropriate decision and the best decision for that company. And that's the same thing that happens in the brain.
Well, and I think it's so interesting where for so long in science and anatomy and neurology, we were talking about things in terms of regions so much. So the parietal region, the temporal region, and where emotions are stored. And what we're seeing is the importance in connectivity. I just read an article this morning talking about the importance of connectivity in mental health. And they're saying it's less about the region and more about the connectivity throughout the brain. And from what you're saying here, that fits beautifully in that the connectivity, the communication from all parts of the brain contribute to that frontal lobe and that ability to make decisions. So I think about that executive of if there's a disconnect in one of the departments of a company, it's not just about that department, it's about how that department communicates with the other departments. And I think about this when it comes to sensory pieces. I feel that lately, more than ever, I've heard parents minimizing sensory concerns where they're saying, you know, oh, it's just, you know, yeah, he's a sensory kid, or, oh, it's, you know, they're just particular, but kind of minimizing that. But to me, the importance of the sensory information is that's how I engage and interact with the world. And so to be able to make appropriate decisions and to direct my attention and to hold information in working memory, that's all based on the sensory input and information I'm taking in. And so that sensory information, that green area, is taking in information to then communicate with the area of our brain that controls our emotions and that prefrontal cortex that allows us to maintain our attention and maintain our goal-directed behavior.
You're 100% correct. And to just go a little further, you know, you mentioned the sensory area, but the sensory area associates with the emotional area. The emotional area associates with the back area called the occipital area, the visual area. And there are association areas, and they all fire and wire together to form a whole, to form a big picture as to the world around us. And then that is transferred, and the frontal lobe takes that information to make decisions. So if any one of these areas are weak, all the other areas are not coordinating correctly with that area. So when you talk about connectivity, that's what the brain does. The brain is made up of billions of neurons making trillions of connections, and they all have to happen at the right time, the right speed, the right tempo, like a beautiful orchestra. You could have an orchestra with 100 musicians. If 12, 15, 20 are playing at the wrong time, the wrong speed, the wrong tempo, you're going to walk out of that concert.
Sure.
So timing, coordination, the cerebellum is involved with timing, coordination. All these different parts of the brain are involved with all these different areas that are critical for executive functions to take hold and be effective.
You know, one of the things that's come up in a few of our conversations came up when we were talking about working memory, when we were discussing with Dr. Joaquin Ingera of UCSF, is how fragile our executive functions are. Will you talk to us a little bit about kind of how and why those high-level brain functions are such fragile items or precious resources is the way I think of it?
Yes, because the brain developed through millions of years, and we have old parts of our brain and we have new parts of our brain. So the old parts of our brain, for example, when you walk down a street, you don't say, okay, I'm going to put my right foot in front of my left foot, and then I'm going to swing my right arm and swing my left arm. No, that happens automatically. So automatic movements are part of our older parts of our brain. But we have newer parts of our brain. And one of the newest parts of our brain is the frontal lobe or the prefrontal cortex. As a matter of fact, prefrontal cortex separates humans from all other animals. The prefrontal cortex or the frontal lobe comprises 33%, as you can see on this graphic, 33% of the human brain. The next lowest animal is the chimpanzee, which only uses 17% of their frontal lobe. So it's very, very important, the frontal lobe. At the same time, the newer parts of our brain have the lowest breakdown threshold. So what does that mean? That means the newer parts of our brain tend to be, in a way, the weakest and can break down the easiest. And that's why the frontal lobe is so fragile. And that's why when we talk about this epidemic of childhood neurodevelopmental disorders, 10 million children a year are on diagnosed with ADHD, and that's just diagnosis. There are many children who still have severe attention organization challenges that aren't diagnosed. So we're talking about a real epidemic here, and that frontal lobe, because it is the newest, has the biggest tendency to break down.
And I think that understanding that breakdown threshold for parents, I think, is so important, because as a parent, we're watching our child all day, every day. And we can see a day where, gosh, my child did their homework, there was no meltdowns, they got it turned in, they didn't fight with their brother, it was a good day. And then the next day, you know, it fill in the blank, it doesn't go well. And as a parent, we can sit there watching, saying, what's wrong? Why did yesterday go well and today didn't go well? What can I do different? But I think understanding how fragile those newer, higher level parts of the brain are so important. And that's why when I always say it takes the sun, the moon, and the stars aligning when a child struggles with executive functions in order to bring out the best in them. And we want our kids to be able to be as consistent as they can possibly be day to day. But when we have a child or an adult that struggles with executive functions, we're going to be, that threshold breakdown is going to be more susceptible to lack of sleep. So if I had a couple nights in a row where I got 5 hours of sleep at night instead of 8 hours of sleep, that catches up, and suddenly I'm going to have a harder time maintaining my focus, regulating my mood and emotions when I'm upset. If I've gone too long without eating and I've run out of the fuel to support high-level brain function, you know, I love the term hangry. When we run out of fuel, you're going to have a hard time making decisions and controlling emotions. And so that fragility is not just over the evolutionary development, but also day-to-day and the resources that we use to support function.
So that's a very, very good point. And the brain has strength, stamina, and endurance, like any other part of the brain, like any other part of the body, like a muscle, for example. The brain is also an electrical system. So any electrical system has to have a good capacitor, resistor. A computer, for example, has to have a good surge protector. The computer doesn't have a good surge protector and gets a surge of electricity, it's going to crash. Well, the brain is no different. So when the brain is not maturing correctly and these systems are not developing correctly, just the word no could cause the brain to crash. And when we run out of stamina, there's nothing left in the gas tank. So let's take a child who has weakness in the frontal part or executive dysfunction or neurodevelopmental imbalance. Well, they're at school all day. They're using their brain. By the time they come home, there's nothing left in the gas tank. But yet, they're expected to run a second marathon after running a first marathon at home and do homework for the next 30, 45, 60 minutes, 2 hours. It's not realistic. So that's why we really have to get the brain strengthened, coordinated, so that we could build up the stamina in the brain, which is absolutely doable because the brain is what we call plastic and moldable and changeable and can be strengthened just like a muscle.
And that's the part of the conversation that I always love is the hope. Let's talk about neuroplasticity. So start with the definition for us of neuroplasticity.
So the term in neuroscience, plastic, means moldable. So plasticity means moldable. So neuroplasticity means the brain is moldable and changeable based on our experiences. The brain, actually, this might be a good time to show that picture of a neuron. Can we show that picture of a neuron? Oh, there we go. Okay. So this is, your brain is made up of billions of these neurons, making trillions of connections all day long in milliseconds. Now, you could have a nerve that's very strong. A nerve is like a tree. You could have a tree with a lot of thick branches and roots, the one on the left, or you could have a nerve that has very few branches and roots, the one on the right. Well, the nerve on the right could get overwhelmed very easily. The nerve on the right can't receive and send information appropriately. And these two neurons, by the way, can't even coordinate and connect, which we call synapses. Synapses are known as are connections. However, the really good news about this is by stimulating these nerves in an appropriate way, having it be progressively challenging through sensory stimulation, motor stimulation, cognitive stimulation, all natural environmental stimulation, we could actually get these neurons to grow more branches and more roots. And when that happens, now we could have good connectivity between all parts of the brain. So the term neuroplasticity is through life. The beauty about children is that children go through growth phases in the brain where certain hormones, neurotropic hormones, actually sprout these neurons. They start to sprout to find homes with other neurons. That doesn't happen in adulthood. Doesn't mean an adult can't grow more neurons. An adult could, not neurons, I'm sorry. The adult can't grow more branches. The adult can grow more branches, but in a child, we really want to take advantage of those growth phases so that now these neurons and dendrites and branches could start connecting with each other. So that is the basis of neuroplasticity.
So what you're saying, if we take this, back to what we were discussing earlier. So if we have a child that or an adult that's struggling with executive function pieces, any of those areas, that's an indicator in lack of strong connections throughout the brain, making it harder for the individual to manage those goal-oriented tasks. And if those executive functions are weaker or less mature than they should be, that's an indicator that we potentially have nerves that aren't as well branched, well developed, so they have fewer connections.
Yes.
And when there's neurons with fewer connections, it makes it harder for them to communicate.
That's correct. And we use the term cognitive overload. So everyone today experiences cognitive overload. Children, adults, you can't wake up without hearing the news, seeing all that's going on, looking at your phone, looking at your emails. The brain has to take in this information. But if you have weakened systems in the brain, you're not going to be able to handle this cognitive load because of what we're showing you right here on the screen. So by strengthening these neuronal connections, we could handle cognitive overload in a more efficient way. And when we do that, we're organizing better, we're focusing better, we're planning better, we're making better decisions, we're having better emotional regulation, we're having better relationships with our spouses or significant others. So all of it involves improving connectivity and strengthening these neuronal connections.
You just described brain health.
Yes. Okay. That's why I knew that.
I love it. I love it. Well, so when we talk about, so you said because of the principles of neuroplasticity, when children, it tends to change faster because of those neuronal growth spurts that kids go through, but adults are able to form additional and new connections as well. And we talked about how environmental pieces contribute to that. So you talked about having things be progressively challenging. I think that's a really important piece. So for the parents that have joined us here today that are saying, okay, I feel like this pertains to my child, but what do I do with this information? What are things that parents can do? And then what is it about the Brain Balance program that works to increase the synapses and connections in the brain to lead to better executive functions?
So throughout this conversation, we've been talking about bottom-up approaches. We've been talking about making sure that the systems that need to be in place for the brain to coordinate appropriately, have good endurance, and have good stamina, these systems need to be examined and looked at. If we find weaknesses or gaps in these key foundational brain systems, and I'm talking about sensory systems, motor systems, cognitive systems, processing systems in the brain, even in children, for example, certain reflexes that are critical for brain development in children, but those reflexes, called primitive reflexes, need to be integrated into the brain so the brain can use them for higher level functions. If these reflexes are not integrated, this is a red flag. These need to be looked at. So the unique part about the Brain Balance program is that we take this bottom-up approach and look at these key foundational brain systems with the goal of building up these key systems that should have been in place through development so that the child could get good synchronization and connectivity in the brain. This is known as a bottom-up approach. We also look at it hemispherically from one side of the brain to the other. There are certain symptoms and signs that could indicate to us one side of the brain or the other might be weak. Now, a top-down approach is, again, okay, here's your organizer. Okay, look at this chart. But that doesn't allow the brain to do it naturally and on its own. So that's the beauty of the Brain Balance program. Now, in addition, you mentioned earlier in our discussion, nutrition, electronics, going to bed early. So not only do we want to build up these key foundational brain systems and improve connectivity in the brain to allow a child to be more functionally capable of learning, behaviorally, emotionally, from an attention standpoint, an emotional standpoint, social standpoint. We want to also make sure if we're building connections and we're building pathways, that the body has the tools and the nutrition building blocks necessary to do this. So if you have a Ferrari, you're not going to give it the worst quality gas. You spent $200,000 on a car. You're not going to give it the worst quality gas. Well, your child is worth more than a Ferrari. So why would you give it poor nutrition? So nutrition is very important. It's a very integral part of our program. Clean, healthy eating. There's a lot of aspects to that I don't think we have enough time today to really go into all that. But nutrition is critical. Sleep. Talk about electronic use. So there's a lot of things in the Brain Balance program aside from these bottom-up approaches that we help parents with, coach parents with, support parents with, to make sure that their family and life and the child are getting the best they can to reach their potential.
Yeah, and I think there's two key points that I want to make here. I think for parents, again, if what you're seeing at home is the top-down approach that you're doing, so whether it's a child that's struggling with learning and so you're putting tutoring in place, or a child that's struggling with behavior, so you're putting a strategy in place, or struggling with organization and putting an agenda in place. If a bottom-up approach is needed, that top-down approach isn't going to be as effective. And so if the approach that you're doing is working, run with it. That's fantastic. If it's doing the trick, then that means there's enough of a foundation there to absorb what you're providing. But if you're finding that giving your child an agenda and you're needing to help them year after year with these same pieces and they're not growing and evolving there, that can be a sign that some underlying foundational pieces might need to be strengthened so that that strategy that you're teaching them can be more effective. And then I think the other piece is something, again, that I've noticed over the years with families is I describe them as flush out years, where there's times where these things can become more obvious. And the 10th grade classroom experience last night reminded me of this, is there's times in our life where there's a big jump in what expectations are. So when you think about a child going from elementary school to middle school, there's a big jump in executive function expectations. That child needs to remember their class schedule, their locker combination, what items they need to grab from their locker for each class. Then when you're shifting from middle school to high school or high school to college. So there's times when what we see is there's a jump in executive function demands. And we want to see, is your child able to meet those higher level demands? If they're struggling to meet the demands at the level they're at now, then our executive function demands over time in life get more, not less. There's the jump from high school to college, college to job, to real life. And so really looking to see how much support they're needing now to be successful with their executive functions so that they're able to meet the challenges that will come next in life.
And I just want to add one thing. You brought up a good point. What we're discussing now is not either or. The goal of what we're discussing here is to allow the child to be more functionally capable of benefiting from tutoring, from psychotherapy, from 504 plans, from IEP plans, which are top-down approaches. So it's not either bottom-up or top-down. The bottom-up approach, the brain balance approach, is to allow the child to be more functionally capable of benefiting from all the great work parents and teachers are trying to do. And that's really the key to the whole thing. It's synergistic.
Spot on with that comment. All of those things and services are important and valid and needed, and all are complementary. And again, to wrap it up, and then we've got some time to take some parent questions here, is when we think about what our kids go through on a daily basis, is they wake up in the morning, they're picking their outfit for the day, they're trying to take in mind what the weather's going to be for what they're wearing to school. Do they remember to grab everything they needed, their lunchbox, their water bottle? They make it to class. The demands on our attention, our emotions, our working memory are constant. And the sensory experience of a child sitting in a classroom at any age is enormous. Their brain is working so hard throughout the day to take in, process, block out, react, interact, socialize, and learn. There's so much happening all day throughout the day. And so any areas of immaturity and development with foundations is going to make it such that the child has to work harder to accomplish the same thing, which goes back to what you were describing, is when our kids come home from school, they're exhausted. Their brain has run a marathon working all day. And so understanding the energy and effort that's getting put in on a daily basis from our kids, and then looking to see what we can do to help to support that effort. Victoria, do you want to join to see if there were any questions that came in while we were visiting? Or Mark, is there anything else that you want to add?
No, I think we covered a lot. I mean, look, we could talk for hours about this, but I think we gave a good background as to hopefully the folks out there have a little bit of a different understanding that their child is really not misbehaving on purpose. Really is a big thing I hear, oh, he's just not motivated. If she was just a little more motivated, she's so smart. Yes, very, very smart in certain parts of the brain, but other parts of the brain are not connecting appropriately. So there's no child who really wakes up one day and says, I just want to do bad in school. I don't want to pay attention. It's a buildup over time of children trying and trying and trying, but really don't have the tools to do it.
And smart and capable are not mutually exclusive. You can have a brilliant child that struggles with executive function, but when executive functions are in place, it's going to allow that intelligence to shine through all the more.
100%. We see it all the time.
Okay, great. Thank you both so much. We have a lot of really good questions, and we have about 12 minutes to take them. So I'm just going to get started. Okay, Sarah, thank you so much for your thoughtful question. How does maturity and growth weigh into development of executive functions? In other words, can we expect them to grow over time without direct intervention?
Good question. So at every age, there's a certain level of vigilance, attention, ability. So obviously there's a wide range of a child. You could have a typical child who might be a little hyperactive or might be a little jumpy. There's another child who might keep his hands folded. Yes, teacher, what could I do for you? Yes, mom, could I take out the garbage? But when those aspects fall out of those ranges and the child really starts to struggle, that's when we have to look at intervention.
Yeah, and I would agree when things start to disrupt and interfere with daily life, with social interactions, with relationships at home, with a relationship of learning in class, that's when it's time. And you will see growth and change over time. The question is it on track with age appropriate development? So if I have a child that's aging up year by year, as we do when 365 days go by, but their development is maturing at a slower rate, that gap, even though they're progressing, that gap can widen over time. So we do expect to see continued growth and momentum through movement, through sensory experiences. Our brain will continue to learn and grow and adapt when we're using it and we're active. The question is it maturing on track with the child? We want biology and development to be aligned and not misaligned.
Okay, thank you. Cassandra is asking, can you speak more on the growth phases the brain goes through?
Yes, I can. So there's an incredible book about this. Thatcher did a whole treatise on this. The brain goes through growth phases from birth, and there are periods of rapid growth. Genetically driven rapid growth, but then environmentally driven pruning. Every 1.5 to 3 years, the brain goes through these growth phases. At 2 to 3.5 years old, the brain has more connections than it will ever have in life. And then we go through a pruning phase. So we have 2 to 3 years old, then we have 4 to 7 years old, then we have 12 to 13 years old, then we have 15 to 18 years old. So we're always going through these growth phases. There are many growth phases that occur. Now, it's critical to have these growth phases occur on a normal foundation, on a typical foundation. That's why we have to intervene with children as early as possible. So we get these growth phases occurring in a typical way. Because if growth phases occur and there's an imbalance, you're not going to get the benefit of that growth phase and good connectivity in the brain.
And I find for parents, we watch the physical growth phase, right? My 13-year-old son, he's now the same height as me, and that happened in the last month. So we see these explosions in the physical growth. It's hard to pinpoint and understand the growth explosion that can happen cognitively and developmentally. But sometimes when you step back, you can see it, where all of a sudden your child's making connections and having conversations at a deeper level, or able to manage their time in a way that you haven't seen before. Our kids go through developmental and cognitive growth phases in the same way they have those physical growth spurts.
And sometimes you can't see the growth phase in the brain. So it's
Right.
easier when you could take a ruler and have them stand next to the wall.
For sure. Okay, Rachel is asking, which pieces of the Brain Balance program would help a 12-year-old with low working memory and slow processing?
So that's a good question. So the two areas you're describing are, one of them we spoke about, working memory and visual processing. The Brain Balance program, really the goal of the Brain Balance program is to get all the areas of the brain to start to coordinate and fire and wire appropriately. So we don't focus on working memory per se, and we don't focus on visual processing, although many of our children have weak visual processing. We have an assessment that we do. We look at visual processing, auditory processing, timing in the brain, vestibular function, all the bottom-up pieces. So when you get all the areas of the brain to start to coordinate and fire appropriately, visual processing improves, auditory processing improves, timing improves, working memory improves, because now the brain itself is maturing in a way that it's supposed to, and the connectivity is occurring in a typical way. That's the way we have to do it. You can't just go to a class for working memory. And I will tell you, a lot of our parents have gone through vision training. Great thing. Vision training is necessary. But there's still something lacking. There's still weaknesses in many other areas. So the Brain Balance program focuses on visual processing, auditory processing, timing, all of these areas at once to get all these areas to start to coordinate.
And I think what's so interesting is we tend to want to do things, think about things really linearly, right? If I struggle here, what can I practice here to make that better? And we're saying, why is the brain struggling with that in the first place? What isn't coming online and connecting and communicating so that that area is a struggle? So by strengthening that underlying foundation, you see change not just in working memory, but in many areas. And that's one of the things in some of the research studies that have been published recently. The school pilot study that just went live on a press release here today is looking at students with attentional and behavioral challenges in a classroom, and they completed a brain balance program on site at a school and saw a significant reduction in attention and behaviors in the classroom. Those students also saw an increase in reaction time and an increase in test accuracy. So by strengthening that underlying foundation, not only did it improve those executive functions of good goal-oriented behavior, of less hyperactivity and impulsivity, less challenges of inattention, but it also then, there was increases seen or suggested seen through processing, visual processing and working memory by that increase in reaction time and test accuracy.
And I'll add one last thing. I know there's a lot of questions. You want to go on to the next one, or should I add?
One last thing, finish that thought.
Okay. So there's a type of plasticity. We spoke about plasticity. Another type is called Hebbian plasticity. And what that means is when you stimulate the brain in a strong area, at the same time you're stimulating the brain in a weak area, the weak area gets stronger by virtue of that strong system firing. That's why at Brain Balance, we need to fire all these systems together, because the weakened systems benefit from the strong systems being fired. And the brain will always go down to its lowest level of function. So if you build up the visual processing system, but at the same time have weak proprioception, weak auditory processing, weak executive functions, that strength of visual processing will now start to diminish, because all these other areas are not able to really coordinate together. So that's an important point.
Thank you. Can you spell that for people?
What?
Hebbian plasticity. Will you spell that so they know what you said?
Hebbian. Donald Hebb, Hebb, considered to be the father of neuroplasticity.